The silence of the cosmos is not empty. It is a patient, ancient thing, filled with the dust of dead stars and the faint echoes of civilizations long gone. It rarely notices the fleeting passions of young species. But on that day, the silence itself seemed to hold its breath. Around the third planet of a forgotten yellow star, reality itself buckled. Not with a bang, but with a chilling, synchronized ripple as 15,000 warships tore open space-time and arranged themselves in a perfect, suffocating sphere. They were the Galactic Confederation, a coalition of species bound by a single, unshakable creed. Order follows strength. Their fleet was not an army. It was a geological event, a storm of polished, obsidian-colored metal that blotted out the stars and cast a permanent, artificial eclipse upon the world below. On the command deck of the flagship, the Inevitable, Supreme Commander Vorlag of the Cathar surveyed the blue and white marble hanging in the main view screen. His species was one of calculated brutality, entities who had evolved to see emotion as a design flaw. To him, this world, Earth, was merely another data point in a long and predictable equation. Primitive radio waves, leaking into the void for a mere century, had been their invitation. The Confederation had answered, as it always did, to impose structure upon chaos. The ultimatum was broadcast on every frequency the humans possessed, a message of elegant simplicity translated by the ship's logic engines. "Your world is now a protectorate," the voice declared, devoid of malice or triumph. It was a statement of fact. Surrender your resources, relinquish your sovereignty, your biological and cultural distinctiveness will be archived. Comply, and your species will be allowed to persist, resist, and your existence will be reclassified as a geological footnote. The Confederation expected one of two responses. The first, and most common, was panicked, disorganized resistance, a flurry of primitive nuclear weapons that would be swatted from the sky like insects, followed by a swift and total pacification. The second was immediate, groveling submission. Both outcomes were acceptable and led to the same end. What they did not expect was the third response, silence. For 12 standard hours, Earth fell silent. Its cacophony of broadcasts, its endless stream of chatter and music and meaningless noise, ceased. The Confederation's analysts interpreted it as fear, a species collectively paralyzed by the sight of gods in their sky. It was a logical, acceptable conclusion. But to a few, a very few among the ancient and diverse crew, it felt wrong. It was too disciplined, too unified. Then the anomaly occurred. A single minuscule vessel detached itself from the planet's surface. It was so small that at first, the fleet's automated defenses disregarded it as debris. It broadcasted a simple, archaic radio signal, repeating a single request in the Confederation's primary trade language, a language it should not have known. The request was absurd, illogical, almost insane. It asked for permission to approach and dock. On the bridge of the Inevitable, a wave of confusion rippled through the crew. A warrior race, the Vylok, growled in amusement. A silicon-based species, the Shapers, pulsed with discordant light patterns. Commander Vorlag himself felt the first flicker of something his people had long since purged. Curiosity. He had crushed empires that spanned star systems. He had witnessed the birth of black holes and the death of suns. Yet this tiny act of defiance was perhaps the most irrational thing he had ever encountered. He gave the order. "Permit them to approach. I wish to see the face of this planet's arrogance." The shuttle, no larger than one of their own escape pods, slowly, deliberately, made its way through the metal web, a single firefly navigating a forest of iron giants, preparing to land in the heart of the storm. The docking bay of the Inevitable was a cathedral of cold engineering. It was vast enough to house a small moon, its polished surfaces reflecting the sterile blue-white light that was the hallmark of Cathar design. A contingent of Vylok warriors stood at attention, their carapaces gleaming, their multi-jointed limbs holding plasma rifles that could core a continent. They formed a rigid, intimidating honor guard leading from the docking clamp to the main corridor. Every member of the Confederation present had a theory about what would emerge from the human vessel. The Vylok expected a champion, a warrior sent to die with honor. The Shapers anticipated a machine, an AI emissary sent to plead with a superior intelligence. Commander Vorlag, watching from the bridge's tactical display, held no expectations, only a cold analytical curiosity. The door of the human shuttle, scarred with the telltale marks of atmospheric re-entry, hissed open with a puff of recycled air. The creature that stepped out was an immediate disappointment to the Vylock. It was small, bipedal, and distressingly soft-looking. It wore no armor, only a simple, dark fabric tunic and trousers. Its face was biologically expressive, a trait shared by many lesser species, but its expression was one of placid neutrality. It was female, according to the passive bioscans that were already cross-referencing her with the limited data gleaned from human broadcasts. She carried a simple, worn case in one hand. This was Ambassador Chen. She paused for a moment, her eyes adjusting to the harsh light of the hangar. She looked at the towering armed aliens before her, beings who could tear her limb from limb without effort. She took in the sheer, overwhelming scale of the warship around her. Then she did something that sent a tremor of cognitive dissonance through every logical mind watching. She smiled. It was not a smile of fear or submission. It was not a baring of teeth like the predatory grin of the Vylock. It was a gentle, symmetrical curving of the lips, an expression that the Confederation's archives, for all their data on 1,000 species, could only classify as positive social signaling. But the context was wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. Positive signaling was for allies, for trade partners, for equals. It was not for a representative of a caged species facing imminent extinction. The Vylock guards shifted uncomfortably, their battle-honed instincts screaming that this was a trick, though they couldn't identify the threat. The Shapers watching via internal sensors pulsed a sequence of confused magenta light. The smile was a piece of data that broke the equation. As she was escorted from the docking bay, Ambassador Chen walked with a steady, unhurried gait. Her head was held high, her gaze sweeping across the architectural marvels of the alien vessel, not with fear, but with a quiet, genuine interest. Her escorts, and indeed the ship's internal sensors, monitored her every physiological sign. Her heart rate was calm, her breathing even. There were no spikes in adrenaline, no indicators of the fight-or-flight response that every sentient organism possessed. She was, by all biological metrics, behaving as if she were taking a pleasant stroll through a museum. This profound disconnect between her situation and her reaction was more unnerving than any open act of hostility could have been. It was a quiet declaration that the Confederation's greatest weapon, fear, had absolutely no effect on her. It suggested that the humans were operating under a set of rules that the rest of the galaxy had never encountered. The journey ended at the massive obsidian doors of the command bridge. They slid open silently, revealing the heart of the fleet. Inside, dozens of beings from a dozen different worlds worked at their stations, a silent, efficient testament to the Confederation's power. And in the center, on a raised platform, stood Supreme Commander Vorlag, his towering obsidian form silhouetted against the vast view screen. The screen was not filled with star charts or tactical data. It was filled with the image of her world, blue, white, and fragile, a deliberate, final piece of intimidation. Ambassador Chen walked to the center of the deck, stopped a respectful distance from the commander, and placed her worn briefcase on the floor beside her. She looked up at the being who held her world's fate in his hands, and the smile returned, this time with a glint of something new in her eyes. It wasn't fear, it was patience. Silence reigned on the bridge of the inevitable. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, filled with the unspoken authority of 1,000 conquered worlds. Supreme Commander Vorlag looked down at the small human, his height and the raised platform giving him an almost godlike vantage point. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, resonant rumble that seemed to emanate from the ship itself. "You are the representative of species designation 734, he stated, not asked. "Your presence here is a statistical improbability. Your world is surrounded. Your extinction is a matter of administrative decision. Explain your purpose. There will be no negotiation for terms of surrender, only clarification of them." The entire bridge crew focused on the human. This was the moment of capitulation. the point where the lesser species would finally break and plead for its existence. Ambassador Chen met Vorlag's gaze without flinching. Her calm demeanor remained unshaken. "I am Ambassador Chen," she said, her voice clear and steady, carried by the bridge's internal acoustics. "And I am here because you are new to this part of the galaxy, and on my world, it is customary to greet new neighbors." She then knelt, not in submission, but with a simple, fluid motion, and unlatched her worn briefcase. The click of the latches echoed in the silent room, a sound far too small and mundane for the setting. Inside, there were no weapons, no advanced technology, no object of value that any race in the Confederation would recognize. There was a collection of carefully wrapped packages. This singular act was the point of no return. She had been given a stage to beg, and instead, she had redefined it as a welcome ceremony. Vorlag's photoreceptors narrowed. The Vylok captain, Grak, who stood near the command platform, let out a low growl of confusion. This was not the behavior of the conquered. "Neighbors?" Vorlag's voice was laced with the cold sting of contempt. "Your species is a transient biological phenomenon. We are the permanent state of the galaxy. The distinction is fundamental." "Is it?" Chen replied softly, rising to her feet. She picked up one of the packages, wrapped in a simple blue-colored paper. "Commander Vorlag, we did not know what to offer a being who commands a fleet that can eclipse a star. So we offer a symbol. On our world, when a new structure is built to last, we lay a cornerstone, something to mark the foundation. This is a piece of granite from the oldest mountain range on Earth. It has endured for nearly 500 million of our years. We thought it a fitting gift to acknowledge your permanence." She placed the heavy stone gift on the deck, a clear offering. She then turned, her movements deliberate, to Captain Grak. "For the Vylok," she said, holding out a long, slender package. "Our data on your people is limited, but it suggests you value strength and personal combat. This is a tachi, a handcrafted steel blade. It is obsolete as a weapon, but it is considered a work of art by my people. A warrior's soul, captured in metal." She continued this pattern, addressing the Shaper emissary with a complex, hand-carved puzzle box and a Zelosian trade minder with a container of rare aromatic spices from Earth. Each gift was simple, almost primitive, yet deeply symbolic and clearly researched. This was the first subtle deployment of humanity's most dangerous trait. She was not addressing the Confederation. She was addressing the Cathar, the Vylok, the Shapers, and the Zelosians. She was peeling back the label of the monolithic empire and speaking to the individuals within it. She was forcing them to remember their own cultures, their own identities, separate from the cold unity of the fleet. For the first time in centuries, on the command deck of their most powerful warship, the members of the Galactic Confederation were being treated not as a single entity, but as a room full of strangers. And as they looked at the strange, thoughtful gifts laid before them, the first, imperceptible cracks began to form in the foundation of the empire. For a long moment, the only sound on the bridge was the faint, ambient hum of the ship's life support. Captain Grak of the Vylok stared at the handcrafted blade, his warrior's mind struggling to reconcile the object's symbolic weight with its practical uselessness. The Shaper emissary remained motionless, but its internal light patterns cycled through hues of analytical curiosity. Chen's strategy, in its sheer absurdity, had momentarily disrupted the rigid hierarchy of the command deck. They were no longer just officers of a fleet. They were individuals who had been seen, acknowledged. Then, Vorlag moved. He took a single deliberate step forward, and the illusion of equality shattered. "Trinkets!" The Supreme Commander's voice cut through the silence, each word a shard of ice. "You bring trinkets and fables to a reckoning. You presume to understand us by studying the scraps of data you stole from the void, and you respond with sentiment." He made a gesture with one of his upper limbs, a dismissive flick. "Your gesture is noted and reclassified, not as diplomacy, but as a symptom of a species that mistakes emotion for power. Allow me to provide a more effective demonstration of communication." He turned his gaze to the navigation officer. "Target the largest satellite of the planet. Designation: Moon. Engage a single gravity lance, low power. I want to move it, not destroy it. a positional shift of 3 degrees on its orbital axis. Execute. The order was so casual, so devoid of malice, that it was more terrifying than any declaration of war. On the main view screen, a thin, almost invisible beam of distorted space-time shot from a nearby warship and enveloped Earth's moon. There was no explosion, no sound. There was only a silent, sickening lurch. The familiar face of the celestial body, a silent witness to humanity's entire history, shifted. From the perspective of the bridge, the change was subtle, but the tactical displays lit up with new data, showing the catastrophic ripple effect of the act. The tidal forces on the planet below were thrown into chaos. Vorlag knew, with cold certainty, that coastlines across the globe were at that very moment being swallowed by sudden, violent tsunamis. Weather patterns that had been stable for millennia would unravel into superstorms. It was violence on a scale the humans could not even comprehend, delivered with the surgical precision of a god. It was an attack not on their cities, but on the very stability of their world. Ambassador Chen watched the screen, her face pale. For the first time, her composure broke. A tremor ran through her body, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She could see the telemetry, the projections of devastation. She could picture the shores of her childhood home, the cities filled with billions of people, now facing an unimaginable catastrophe. This was the cost of her gambit. The weight of every life now drowning, every home now shattered, fell upon her shoulders. The gifts on the floor suddenly seemed pathetic, foolish. The silence on the bridge returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of absolute, uncontested dominance. The other alien officers, who had for a moment been intrigued, now stared forward at their consoles, their allegiance snapping back into place, their minds cowed by the raw, casual power they had just witnessed. Vorlag let the moment stretch, allowing the horror to sink in. He wanted the human to understand the chasm between their species. He wanted her to feel the utter futility of her existence. Finally, he spoke again, his voice calm and methodical. That was the flexing of a single finger, the result of a single thought. Your stones and your handcrafted blades are meaningless. Your social rituals are a biological dead end. Your planet continues to exist because I have not yet decided to erase it. He took a step back, resuming his position of command on the platform. Now, he rumbled, the sound echoing with finality, let us return to the topic of your unconditional surrender. I trust you now have a more accurate perspective for our discussion. Ambassador Chen stood in the epicenter of the silent storm, the aftershock of Vorlag's power rippling through her. The view screen no longer showed a placid blue marble, but a world in turmoil, weather patterns spinning into violent new shapes. For a full minute, she said nothing. The despair was a physical thing, a crushing weight that threatened to bring her to her knees. This was the end. Her strategy had failed, her gifts were meaningless, and her arrogance had cost millions of lives. The path of surrender was the only logical one left. Surrender, and perhaps save the billions who remained. Her shoulders slumped. It was over. But then something shifted. In the depths of her despair, a different feeling began to burn. It was not hope. It was rage. A pure, cold, human rage. It was the fury of a protector seeing its family threatened. Vorlag, in his infinite logical arrogance, had made a critical mistake. He thought he had attacked a planet, a collection of resources and biological matter. He failed to understand that he had attacked a home. He saw humanity as a statistic, not as a network of fiercely loyal bonds. He had shown her the death of strangers, assuming it would break her. He did not realize that, to a human, there is no such thing as a stranger when the whole species is under threat. In that moment, Chen stopped reacting. She began to fight back. She straightened up, her spine stiffening into a column of iron. The paleness in her face was replaced by a flush of defiant color. Her eyes, which had been wide with horror, narrowed into sharp points of focus. She did not look at Vorlag. Her gaze swept past him, deliberately dismissing the commander, and settled on the other beings on the bridge. When she spoke, her voice was no longer the calm, steady tone of a diplomat. It was low, trembling with controlled fury, and it carried a resonance of profound grief that was utterly alien to the sterile bridge. "You did not just move a rock," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You have in the last few minutes drowned more children than the Vylok have lost warriors in a century of conquest." She turned her full attention to Captain Grak, whose grip had tightened on the ceremonial dagger at his hip. "Captain," she said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its intensity, "your people's sagas speak of the time of black tides, when a shift in your world's core drowned your coastal nests. You sing songs of the mothers who were lost, the generation of warriors that never hatched. It is the defining sorrow of your history, the tragedy that forged your honor." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The Supreme Commander has just inflicted that same sorrow upon us, not as an act of war, but as a communications tool. He has used your people's deepest tragedy as a negotiating tactic. Is there honor in that?" Captain Grak flinched as if struck. Before he could process the verbal blow, Chen's gaze moved to the Shaper emissary. "And you," she said, her voice rising again. "Your species achieved sentience by observing the perfect mathematical patterns of crystalline growth. You revere logic, order, and the beauty of a flawless equation. That demonstration of power just created chaotic, unpredictable systems on my world that will take decades to stabilize. It was an act of pure, mindless vandalism on a planetary scale. It is the cosmic equivalent of smashing a perfect crystal with a hammer just to hear the noise. Where's the logic in that?" Her words were weapons, each one forged from her knowledge of their cultures, each one designed to bypass their loyalty to the Confederation and strike at their own identities, their own pride. She was no longer trying to make friends. She was weaponizing their own histories against them, using empathy as an invasive, aggressive force. Vorlag had wanted to show her fear. Instead, she was showing his command staff something far more dangerous: shame. The air on the bridge grew thick and heavy, charged with a tension that transcended mere military discipline. Supreme Commander Vorlag's photoreceptors swiveled slowly, assessing his command staff. He saw it all. He saw the flicker of doubt in the predatory eyes of Captain Grak, a warrior now forced to weigh the concepts of honor and slaughter. He saw the chaotic light patterns of the Shaper emissary, its logical mind struggling to process an act of vandalism that defied its core principles. He saw the other officers subtly shifting their stance, their focus no longer on their instruments of power but on the moral equation this tiny human had forced upon them. She had not attacked his ship. She had attacked his authority, the very foundation of the Confederation's power, unquestioning, unified obedience. His cold logic had been a shield, but her emotional assault had bypassed it entirely, and what lay beneath was a core of pure, ancient rage. Enough. Vorlag's voice was no longer a resonant rumble. It was a sharp, serrated blade of sound. The time for communication, for demonstration, was over. This human was not a diplomat. She was a contagion, a mimetic virus spreading the disease of individuality. And the only cure for a virus is purification. "Guards," he commanded, his voice snapping with fury. Two Vylok warriors, their earlier amusement replaced by grim duty, moved forward and seized Ambassador Chen by the arms. She did not struggle, her body rigid with a new kind of dread. She had prepared for death, but she had not prepared for this. Vorlag's fury was not that of a simple executioner. It was the cold, inventive cruelty of a being who understands that true pain is not physical. "You speak of bonds," Vorlag said, descending from his platform to stand directly in front of Chen. "You believe this collective sentiment is your strength. I will now demonstrate that it is, in fact, your greatest vulnerability. It is the chain I will use to drag your entire species into despair." He turned to his communications officer. "Open a direct one-way visual channel to the planet. Every frequency, every network. Override all local broadcasts. I want every human on that world to see this bridge. I want them to see their ambassador." The officer complied, his movements swift and nervous. On the main view screen, the image of the wounded Earth was replaced by a cascading mosaic of smaller screens, thousands of them, showing homes, public squares, and command centers from all over the world. Terrified faces, from every nation and culture, stared out from the display. They were watching, billions of them. Vorlag gestured, and the guards forced Chen to her knees. Her head was forced up so she could see the faces of her people, and they could see her. She was now a player on a stage worldwide, the unwilling protagonist in a global passion play of despair. People of Earth! Vorlag's voice boomed, translated into 1,000 languages simultaneously, a voice of godlike authority speaking from their own screens. Your leaders sent this single, fragile being to reason with a power that moves moons. They placed their hope in her words, in her rituals. He paused, letting the silence amplify the image of the kneeling, helpless ambassador. That hope has failed. Her words are meaningless. Her rituals are pathetic. You are not witnessing a negotiation. You are witnessing the moment your spirit breaks. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a near whisper meant only for Chen, but which the bridge's sensitive audio pickups might have shared with the galaxy. I will not kill you yet, he hissed. First, you will watch as I erase one of your cities from existence. You will be the face of their failure. Your expression of despair will be the last thing your species remembers. On Earth, a planet held its breath. The initial wave of Vorlag's broadcast was exactly as he'd intended, a tsunami of pure, undiluted terror. In millions of homes, people wept. In military bunkers, generals and soldiers watched, their hands clenched in impotent fury. The message was clear. Their greatest weapons were useless, their armies irrelevant, and their last hope was on her knees, a prisoner to be used as a prop in their psychological execution. Despair was a palpable global phenomenon. The Confederation's analysts registered the initial data spike with cold satisfaction. The planet's emotional state was trending exactly as predicted. Submission was imminent. But then, the data began to change. The trend wavered. On the bridge of the inevitable, Ambassador Chen, held fast by the Vylok guards, lifted her head. She looked past Vorlag, past the intimidating bridge crew, and focused on the mosaic of screens showing her world. She saw the fear in their eyes. She saw the tears. And in that shared gaze, a connection was forged across 150 million kilometers of empty space. Vorlag had intended to make her a symbol of their weakness. He had failed to consider that humans could choose their own symbols. Chen's expression shifted. The terror receded, replaced by a profound and sorrowful resolve. She was no longer afraid for herself. She was now a conduit for the collective grief and defiance of her species. She met the gaze of a billion strangers and, in a gesture that was utterly her own, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. I am with you, and on Earth, the message was received. The shift was subtle at first, then it became a cascade. In a crowded square in Tokyo, a young woman who had been weeping looked up at the screen, saw the ambassador's nod, and stopped crying. She stood up straight. In a pub in Dublin, a man muted the panicked news feed, raised his glass to the screen, and the entire room followed suit. The global networks, which the Confederation expected to be flooded with pleas for mercy and screams of panic, instead lit up with a different kind of signal. It was a flood of data, but it was organized. People were not talking to the aliens, they were talking to each other. They shared images of the ambassador. They shared messages not of fear, but of love, of remembrance, of solidarity. Old enemies in long-forgotten conflicts sent messages of support to each other. The fragmented, chaotic species that was humanity was, under the gaze of its executioner, becoming one. The Confederation's analysts were baffled. Their models had no framework for this. The planet-wide despair was being overwritten by a new, dominant emotional signature, a shared grim acceptance. It was the emotional equivalent of a species looking into the abyss and refusing to blink. On the bridge, Vorlag's communications officer turned to him, his composure finally cracking. "Commander," he reported, his voice laced with disbelief. "The planet's comms traffic. It's stabilizing. We are detecting coordinated mass-scale encrypted data sharing. They are not panicking. They appear to be archiving." Vorlag's gaze snapped to the screen. He saw it too. The faces were no longer just terrified. They were watching, memorizing, They were bearing witness. He had wanted to break their spirit, but he had instead given them a common enemy, a common martyr, and a common purpose. He had intended to broadcast an execution. Instead, he was broadcasting the birth of a unified world. His act of ultimate cruelty had been recontextualized by its victims into an act of ultimate creation. He gave the order to fire on a city, his voice flat, but the victory had already turned to ash in his mouth. A single beam of coherent energy, no thicker than a city block, descended from the belly of one of the warships. It was silent, beautiful, and absolute. It touched the surface of the earth, and the city of Rio de Janeiro, along with its 6 million inhabitants, vanished in a flash of incandescent white light that momentarily blinded the bridge's optical sensors. When the viewscreen recalibrated, there was only a new, perfectly circular bay where a vibrant metropolis had stood moments before. The water of the Atlantic was boiling, rushing in to fill the wound in the Earth's crust. Vorlag had kept his promise. He had erased a city. He expected a scream from his captive, a sob, any acknowledgement of her species' pain. He received only silence. Ambassador Chen watched the smoldering crater, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, but her expression was one of grim, resolute finality. The act, meant to solidify his authority, did the opposite. It shattered the remaining fragments of allegiance on his bridge. Captain Grack of the Vylok looked from the boiling ocean on the screen to the simple, handcrafted sword lying on the deck. That sword was a symbol of honor, of a warrior's soul. The act he had just witnessed was the antithesis of that honor. It was the butchery of the helpless, a massacre without glory, a stain upon his own warrior's spirit just by bearing witness. His loyalty to the Confederation had demanded he watch, but his loyalty to the Vylok Code now demanded retribution. His hand moved slowly to the hilt of his own plasma dagger. He was not the only one. Other officers on the bridge, from species with their own codes and histories of tragedy, could no longer reconcile their duties with the scene before them. Vorlag, blind with pride, noticed none of this. He saw only the kneeling human and the smoking crater. He had won. "It is done," he announced to the bridge, and to the billions still watching. "This is the price of your defiance. This is the fate that awaits any who—" He was cut off. Not by an attack, but by a quiet, humorless laugh from Ambassador Chen. She looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the light of her burning world, and the smile she wore was no longer patient or welcoming. It was the smile of a player in a game of cosmic chess who was about to sacrifice her queen to win the game. "You're wrong, Commander," she said, her voice eerily calm. "This isn't the price. This is the catalyst." She nodded toward the communications console. "You were wondering why we were archiving, why we were coordinating. We weren't just talking to each other. For the last 12 hours, every major radio telescope on Earth, linked as a single-phased array, has been aiming a message at the galactic core. A final broadcast from humanity." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "It contains everything, our history, our art, our science, and of course, a complete unedited recording of everything that has happened since your arrival. Your ultimatum, my negotiation, your demonstration with our moon, and the murder of a city you just committed." Vorlag's photoreceptors widened in dawning horror. Chen delivered the final blow. "We also included something else. The complete, easy-to-replicate schematics for a rugged, cheap, and effective faster-than-light drive, along with a primer on your fleet's tactics and energy signatures. We sent our story, our warning, and our weapon to every emerging world between here and the center of the galaxy. You wanted to make an example of us, Commander. Congratulations. You have succeeded. You have just taught 1,000 worlds how to fight you. You have just armed a galactic rebellion with our ghost." The silence that followed Chen's revelation was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a paradigm shattering. Vorlag stood motionless, the data streaming from his analysts confirming the human's claim. A powerful, focused transmission of complex data originating from the doomed planet, aimed at the heavens. A message in a bottle thrown into the cosmic ocean, carrying the seeds of his empire's destruction. He had come to this primitive world to enforce order, and in his arrogance, he had instead unleashed the blueprint for galaxy-wide chaos. He had not conquered humanity. He had immortalized them. His legacy, which should have been one of absolute order, would now be one of endless grinding insurgency, all spawned from this single disastrous encounter. He was not a conqueror. He was the fool who had taught the sheep how to become wolves. Before Vorlag could issue the order to execute the human, a final, petty act of rage, a sharp metallic sound cut through the air. Shunk. Captain Grak had drawn his plasma dagger. The blade hissed with contained energy, casting a vibrant green glow on his furious face. He did not advance on Vorlag. He simply stood, the dagger held in a formal salute, its tip pointed at his own chest in a gesture of ultimate gravity. "Supreme Commander Vorlag of the Cathar." Grak's voice was a low, guttural roar of judgment that silenced every other sound on the bridge. "You have led the Vylok fleets to 100 victories, and we gave you our loyalty. Today, you led us to dishonor. You have used our might to slaughter the defenseless for no strategic gain. You have shamed our warrior traditions and made a mockery of the codes that bind us." He then lowered the dagger, turning its point toward his commander. "By the first oath of the Vylok Prime, I, Captain Grak, son of Krell, sever my bond of allegiance to your command. You are a butcher, and the Vylok do not serve butchers." That single act of defiance broke the dam. "The Shaper Collective concurs," a synthesized voice announced as the emissary's body began to glow with the unwavering red of a terminated contract. "Logic cannot be served by acts of random chaotic destruction. Our pact is void." A chorus of dissent rose from around the bridge. The Xylosian trademinder, whose species valued agreements above all else, publicly erased the Confederation's insignia from his console. Officers from a dozen other worlds turned their backs on their commander, siding with the Vylok captain. The Bridge of the Inevitable, the ultimate symbol of unified galactic power, had dissolved into a standoff. The guards holding Chen released her arms and stepped back, their allegiance shifting to their captain. She slowly, painfully, rose to her feet, no longer a prisoner, but a spectator to the storm she had created. Vorlag looked around, his cold, analytical mind finally processing the scene of his own downfall. He was surrounded, not by an enemy fleet, but by his own officers, their faces a mixture of contempt, shame, and righteous fury. He had lost. Utterly. He had held a world hostage, and in the end, had only managed to destroy himself. He opened his mouth to give one final command, perhaps to order the fleet to fire upon itself, to burn his failure from the galactic record, but no sound came out. No one was listening anymore. Captain Grak took a single deliberate step toward him. The handcrafted tachi that Chen had gifted him now held in his other hand, its polished steel reflecting the chaos on the bridge. He had made his choice. He would follow the soul of a warrior, not the orders of a tyrant. The chaos on the Bridge of the Inevitable did not end in fire, but in a quiet, solemn transfer of power. Vorlag was stripped of his command insignia and escorted from the bridge, his expression unreadable, a being of pure logic forced to confront the totality of his miscalculation. Captain Grak stood in the center of the command deck, no longer a subordinate, but the de facto leader of a mutiny that had just decapitated the Confederation's military might. The fleet, once a single instrument of power, was now 15,000 ships with 15,000 different questions, their communication channels alight with confusion, accusations, and burgeoning civil war. The great engine of galactic order had seized, its gears shattered by a single, soft-spoken word: humanity. Ambassador Chen stood amidst the quiet turmoil, an island of exhausted calm. Grak approached her, the tachi still in his hand. He looked at the primitive steel blade, then at the woman who had wielded her culture like a weapon. He would not apologize. The Vylok do not apologize for the actions of others. But they do acknowledge debts of honor. "Your people fight with a kind of strength my species has forgotten," Grak said, his voice a low rumble of respect. "You have reminded us that honor is not found in the strength of your weapon, but in the reasons you choose to fight." He gestured to the view screen, where the wounded Earth still hung in the void. The assault on your world is over. What remains of this fleet will withdraw. He paused, the weight of the new galaxy settling on his shoulders. But your broadcast, it has changed everything. The Confederation is broken. You have traded your planet's safety for the galaxy's freedom. A terrible, honorable bargain. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. What kind of species chooses to become a martyr? Chen simply nodded, too tired to speak. She had done what she had been sent to do. Her escort back to the small shuttle was different. The alien officers and crew no longer looked at her with contempt or curiosity. They looked at her with a profound, unsettling awe. They were looking at a ghost. The representative of a species that had faced down gods, lost, and in doing so, had won a war that would span generations. As the shuttle door closed, the last thing she saw was Captain Grak raising the human sword in a silent final salute. The small vessel detached from the flagship and moved away into the void. Chen watched as the great fleet, the metal storm that had threatened to extinguish her world, began to break apart. One by one, then in dozens, the warships turned, their engines flaring as they jumped into hyperspace. Not as a unified armada, but as scattered fragments of a shattered empire, each racing toward an unknown future. Humanity had survived. The planet was scarred, a city was gone, and the tides would forever be a reminder of their brush with extinction. But they were no longer alone. And they were no longer the frightened, scattered species that had looked up at the sky in terror. They were united now, forged into a single entity by the fire of a shared enemy and the legend of a single diplomat. They had sent a welcome to the neighborhood, and in return, they had inherited a galaxy in chaos. They had learned their place in the universe. It was not as subjects, but as the unexpected, terrifying, and heartbreakingly hopeful architects of a new age. They came to silence the voice of Earth, only to transform it into an echo the entire galaxy would learn to repeat. If this journey about human resilience in the face of the impossible resonated with you, there are many other chronicles like it waiting to be told. To join us in future explorations across science fiction and to make sure you don't miss the next story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. And in the comments, we'd like to know, in your opinion, what human trait would be the biggest surprise to an advanced alien civilization? We thank you for your company, and until the next broadcast,